Hello and welcome to Merthyr's Hidden Past, a weekly podcast brought to you by Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and Art Gallery. My name is Christopher Parry and I work in Cyfarthfa Castle, and incidentally we are based in Merthyr Tydfil, which is why the museum and myself tend to focus on the history of Merthyr Tydfil, the town and the borough. But what we like to do with this podcast is focus and shine a light on the lesser known stories and the hidden stories in Merthyr's past. And last week was no exception. We looked back on evacuees and evacuation to Merthyr Tydfil in June 1940, 80 years coming up in a few weeks' time. And it was wonderful to hear so many stories from you guys replying in the comments and letting us know your experiences in Merthyr Tydfil with evacuees and evacuation, and many of you even housing them and remembering them as children, which is amazing to you. This week we're going back to another wartime period in Merthyr, but not World War II this time. We're going back to World War I. And thankfully this week I've got to delve into the museum collection, because obviously at Cyfarthfa Castle we've got an impressive collection of all manner of different objects. But I thought it would be nice to focus this week's story around one of those objects. And so this week's story is all starting with a letter which is from a World War I troop from Merthyr Tydfil. On August 1st, 1915, Reginald Jones, a man from Merthyr, who was a labourer underground in the mines around Merthyr Tydfil before the Great War began, wrote a letter to his fiancée back in Merthyr Tydfil. The letter starts as follows. Dear May, just a few lines to say that I am quite well and that we have gone so far in safety. We are still on the ship, but I mustn't say where we are. We have seen a good many sights since we left England. It was a sight to see sharks in schools together and whales in other parts spouting water, just the same as you see them in the pictures. I have written 3 letters now, love. I hope you have had them, because I know you are anxious. I haven't had a letter since we left. Well, there isn't one that have had a letter, but I don't expect one. I know the situation. Watkins and S. Williams are all right. We are all together so far. Give my best love to all my family. I've got nothing to say now. Love will make up for everything when we meet again, God willing. From your loving Reg. That letter was written by Reg when he was on board the Huntscreen, a ship that was en route to the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. The British Armed Forces planned to attack the Ottoman Empire with a land campaign and a naval campaign to try and take them out of the war altogether. As many of you know, this campaign didn't go to plan, but for Reg, he arrived at the bays around Gallipoli, specifically Salva Bay, on the 8th of August 1915 at 6:30 p.m. Like many troops in the 5th Welsh Regiment, which Reg was part of, he was given the order to prepare for disembarking, and on the following day at 12:30 p.m. they disembarked and headed towards the beaches of Salva Bay. When they landed, they were met by what many described as a perfect hell, a battlefield that was all open and exposed. The beaches had no natural cover, and the Turkish were well fortified and well entrenched on a higher ground, looking over the troops arriving on land. Another Merthyr boy named Jack Williams, who was a boxer in Merthyr, came back to Merthyr Tydfil in October of that year and wrote a letter about his experiences. He said, "We had a hot time landing at the Gallipoli Peninsula. Fighting for 3 days and 3 nights. It was hell. On the 4th day we dug ourselves in, and 18 days passed before we were relieved. Unwashed and unshaved, we looked like a right lot of navvies. And the worst of it was we couldn't get any water without risk of our lives. The trouble was the snipers. We did look mucked up, I can tell you." And Reg's experiences would have been similar. The troops at Salva Bay were all experiencing the same thing. A massive onslaught as soon as they arrived on the beach, and a panic to dig trenches and dig fortifications so they at least had some cover. For Reg, his regiment began to dig in on the 10th of August. Less than 24 hours after the battle started, they realised that they had to almost immediately dig fortifications and trenches to try and protect themselves, which was not easily done because snipers were constantly shooting at them and picking them out while they were digging. It was easy pickings for the Ottoman Empire snipers, who had the higher ground and all this exposed landscape in front of them. The wounded and the dead over the first couple of days of these battles was high. Just in Reg's regiment alone, 100 people were wounded and over 20 were dead, with 3 missing. And that's out of a regiment of just over 200 people, so quite a significant amount of people indeed. When Jack Williams was writing about not being relieved for 18 days, he was quite correct, because unfortunately for them, the bays at Gallipoli were being monitored by German U-boats, and many ships were being destroyed before they even had a chance to relieve the troops on the bays of Gallipoli. Take, for example, the Royal Edward. That was on its way to Gallipoli on August the 15th, and a German U-boat torpedoed it. There were 53 South Wales borderers on board that were there heading to relieve troops entrenched at Gallipoli, and they all lost their lives. In fact, 935 people lost their lives aboard that ship, and the majority of them were members of the Royal Army Medical Corps. It was treacherous indeed, and they would have been remaining outside in the boiling hot sun in the morning and the cold in the night for many, many days without any relief, and with always the fear of snipers. And then the fear of disease after several days and weeks passed, with dysentery and other diseases rife in the trenches. When people describe it as hell, as many people do in their letters, they are not joking by the comparison. One of the Royal Army Medical Corps was actually a man from Merthyr as well. A gentleman from Merthyr Vale, Charles Richardson White, who lived in Merthyr Vale and had a practice down there for many, many years. He actually served in the First and the Second World War. In this First World War, one of the first theatres of war that he entered was on the Gallipoli Peninsula, trying to support his troops by clearing casualties and making sure everyone is okay. He got there a few days after the Prince Edward was torpedoed, after the Royal Edward was torpedoed, and he wrote a letter back while on the Gallipoli Peninsula to describe what was going on that battlefront. And I'll read that to you now. We luckily got through, but I hear the Edward was torpedoed a day or two ago. As soon as we arrived here, we were in the midst of shelling from the ships in the bay and the shrapnel from the Turks. The battalion, meaning the Welsh regiment, the 5th Welsh, the battalion is reduced to half. I have not heard or seen any of the men. They had perfect health from Sunday to Wednesday. Of course, a great deal of the trouble was caused by over-eagerness and want of experience. Those that remain are behaving like veterans and are all doing well. We, meaning the medical personnel, landed after a day or two. The beach from end to end was filled with field ambulances on it, with shelters erected for the wounded. A huge enemy shell is whistling over me now and bursting a half a mile away. 3 clearing stations are on the beach and we are right in the middle. As you can guess, we have had some dreadful scenes, but the men are splendid. None complain, but all as brave as possible. Our food is nothing great to talk about, but it is considerably better than what they would be getting in the trenches. The trenches are only about 2 miles away from where we are now. Shells are pouring over us morning and evening. The heat is great and the flies are terrible. One cannot write down all one would like, but when I see you again, which I am quite confident will be soon, I will tell you. For this cannot last long. An aeroplane dropped bombs only last night just 200 yards away. My knees, arms, breast and face are all sunburnt black. We have no fresh water to wash, and consequently no soap is used. And so the only redeeming feature of this bay is that we are close to the sea, and we can have a dip in it at 5:30 a.m. and 8 p.m. daily. And that is part of the letter that Charles Richardson White sent back to his wife, who was in Merthyr at the time. And I hope that gives you an indication of what life was like for these troops out on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Not long after that, a gentleman who we focused on a few weeks back on a video for Cyfarthfa Castle, a gentleman named Harry Southey, would be entering the battlefront as well. And when he arrived in September, he was met by a totally different regiment that he remembered. He had trained and developed the Welsh regiment as much as possible, and when he met them again, they were battered, beaten and bruised, starving, dehydrated, burnt from sunburnt, dysentery and other diseases running roughshod all over them. And so when he arrived, he had to even take command of the Welsh battalion, because even the senior troops, the officers and whatnot, have been passed away or have been ill from all the disease. Reg, a 22-year-old boy, writing back to his fiancée in Merthyr Tydfil. What happened to Reg is one of those stories that we'll never fully know, because he was declared dead on August the 17th. He was missing and presumed dead. What must have happened is the Reg was one of those first groups of people who died whilst attacking Silver Bay after first coming off the ships. So the first ever battle theatre this gentleman entered, the first time he had ever got out of Wales. He arrived in a country, set his foot down and was mowed down. In fact, a letter that I read to you at the start could well be the last letter and last thing he ever wrote, which makes this letter not just a nice letter from one sweetheart to another during a very tumultuous time in the world. It gives it much more poignancy. Reginald's parents were William Jones and Mary Jones, and they lived on 9 Primrose Hill in Toynrodden in Merthyr Tydfil. Records show as well that Reginald's father was applying for various war medals that his son was entitled to, so obviously it goes without saying that the father and the mother were incredibly proud of the sacrifice that their son had made, and were actively looking to keep his memory alive by applying and making sure that he gets the correct medals and whatnot. Many years later, Reg would be remembered on the Helles Memorial, which is in Turkey, along with 20,000 other troops from the battlefields over that year. It goes without saying that the Gallipoli campaign was a complete failure. And when Harry Southey and Charles Richardson White and all the Merthyr-born boys that were out on that peninsula finally got evacuated and retreated to Egypt, it was the best decision possible. The objects themselves, the letter and an accompanying photograph which shows Mabel and Reginald together, were not just by chance given to Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and Art Gallery. They were deposited there by Mabel's family, and Mabel went on to live a life and have a family of her own, but she would always keep the letter and the photograph of Reg, and her family eventually donated it to Cyfarthfa Castle and told us this story, and we were able to put other bits of the story together on their behalf. So the object is not there by chance, it's there to live on at Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and for the story to live on itself. Sadly, it's one of many, many artefacts and letters and things connected to World War I that have this sad tinge to them, unfortunately. But it is an integral part of our history and our past to look back and realise and think about these objects. And that brings us to the end of this week's podcast. I hope you've been interested and enjoyed listening to this week as well as always. And please find the time to like, share, follow us on anything you can on SoundCloud, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter. We're on them all like many people are. And please certainly tell a friend about the podcast and share it around as much as possible, because at this point where we can only interact digitally via platforms such as this, it is appreciated if you can share it around as much as possible and we can get out there engaging with as many people as possible. So I will be back next week with another story from Merthyr's past, another hidden story from Merthyr's past, and I will speak to you then. Thank you very much and stay safe.